Shani Dhanda is a disability activist and named in the BBC's top 100 most influential women in 2020. She founded the Asian Disability Network and held the first ever Asian Women Festival in the UK. It is my great privilege and pleasure to invite my next guest in the waiting room, the wonderful and talented Shani Dhanda.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Shani.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Not at all. Wonderful. As with so many of our guests and so many of their stories, would you be kind enough to tell us a little bit about where you grew up and, importantly, about your parents?
My dad was born in India, my mum was born here in the UK, so very different people as individuals. They have very different attitudes and outlook towards life because of the different cultures that they were both brought up in. So I guess from a young age, I felt like I had to educate my parents on some things, especially around, the topic of disability, freedom, because I guess with me, I was experiencing a lot all at once. I was a South Asian woman who experiences disability. So not only did I have to deal with all the cultural stuff, but also, other things as well, like navigating my condition. But look, my parents were amazing. I think parents of that generation, first and second generation here, in survival mode, aren't they? So I know my parents have done the best for me.
Your mother in particular has this fierce protectiveness over you, and she in herself is this remarkable woman.
When I was born, my mum was essentially blamed for me being born with the rare genetic condition. It wasn't her fault, it's nobody's fault. It's just one of those things that could have happened, and it did. So I think what I really appreciate though with my mum is that she's just taught me to be strong no matter what. She didn't treat me any differently from my brother or sister. When I was cheeky, I got a smack just like they did. And I'm really glad she didn't treat me any differently, because if my home situation was so protected and so sheltered, and if I had been mollycoddled to the nth degree, I would have found it even more difficult to live in a society in a world that isn't designed for me. So I'm really glad that my mum chose that path and she didn't treat me any differently. I used to break a lot of my bones, and I remember being in plaster, which was a regular occurrence, and my mum just giving me balls of laundry to fold. She's like, you're not getting away with it. But at the time I probably thought it was harsh, but I really appreciate it now when I look back on that time.
Wonderful. And can you educate me and for everyone who's going to be watching and listening? And if I may, with your permission, I'd like to quote you something that I still tell myself to this day because I found it so profound. My disease is a condition. It doesn't disable me. Society does, which I thought was incredibly profound, incredibly powerful. Tell us what condition you were born with, educate us a little bit about it, and perhaps more importantly, and why we're here, the stories that are associated with that.
So I was born with a rare genetic condition. The medical term is Osteogenesis imperfecta. It's more commonly known as brittle bone disease. It's a genetic condition, but it doesn't run in my family, so I'm what they call a spontaneous mutation, which is fun to be. But it's very rare. It only affects about 1 in 15,000 people in the UK. And 34 years ago when I was born, awareness, there wasn't a lot of awareness about the condition. So it actually took 2 years for me to get a diagnosis. And it was all very dramatic, actually. So when I was born, the doctors knew that something wasn't quite right, but they didn't know exactly what. And the main giveaway there was that my limbs, so my arms and legs, they were very bowed. They sort of said to my parents, we don't know what it is yet, take her home, we'll help figure it out. And I can't imagine, what my parents, especially my mum, would have been feeling in that moment, because nothing came up in the scans to raise any sort of concern. So I was very nearly taken into care because I was getting injuries and, you know, it wasn't quite adding up. And of course, I expect that the medical professionals were just doing their due diligence. But because I didn't have a diagnosis, it made it really difficult. So the dramatic part of the story is my bones at the age of 2 were still very bowed. And in my local hospital, I was due to have surgery to have the bones broken and then straightened. The day I was admitted in hospital for that surgery, and I'd had all my pre-med, so they'd knocked me out. I was on my way down to theatre, and a phone call came to say, no, don't do that. We've got in touch with someone at Great Ormond Street, and we're going to send you there because we think we've figured out what this could be. And it sounds really odd saying this, but for my parents, going to London on the train from West Brom, back in the day was a big deal. It was a big adventure. They'd never been in a black cab before. So off they went. They took me to Great Ormond Street, and that's where I met my first consultant. He was my childhood consultant, actually, Dr Bradish, and that's where they got the diagnosis. So I'm really glad that I've got the diagnosis, and I didn't really fully appreciate what that meant for me until I had COVID last year. A diagnosis changes everything. You might not get all the answers from having a diagnosis, but what it does mean is that you've got some sort of guidance. You've got, you might be able to see a professional that might know a bit about it, rather than just sticking your finger in the air saying it could be this, 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 or this. So, yeah, and I guess it was a sense of relief for my parents as well. Although I guess they didn't also get all the answers. They were told, your daughter's got this condition. We can't say what she will or won't go on to do, but the characteristics of my condition are that your bones break without any trauma. And so by the age of 14, I had broken my leg 6 times. When I usually say that, people sort of gasp in shock or in horror, but people with my condition actually can break between 300 to 400 times in their life. So the fact I've only had 6 breaks, I feel immensely grateful for that, very, lucky for that. And yeah, I've had several surgeries to have metal rods in my legs. I've had treatment to strengthen my bone density. So yeah, I hope, touch wood, I remain break-free, but I don't know, I guess as we age, our bones just naturally get weaker as well. But as a result of OI, I also have other conditions. So I have scoliosis, I have osteoarthritis. There's also other risks as well. So there's like a 40% chance that people with OI, when they get into adulthood, they can lose their hearing. So there's all things like this to consider. But I wouldn't change it for the world. I really wouldn't.
Well, I already think that you're wonderful and perfect as you are. And in fact, with OI, you have a particular type, which is actually quite rare. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I have type 3. So there's many different types. Some can range from like being fatal to not really knowing you've got OI. So the main thing about me is I have a short stature. I'm 3'10" in height.
And you and I are both proud Punjabi Sikhs, but you've already alluded, really importantly, what did your family face?
There was nobody else in our community that was in a similar situation where she could have felt supported by, or perhaps spoken to other parents to get some advice. But she sort of said, I'd go to the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple, and I'd hear the women talking. They'd say it was my fault, as in my mum's fault, that she worked too hard in the pregnancy, or she didn't eat this, or she didn't do this. But I think what really horrified me was that, someone that was very close to our family sort of said to my mum, not only have you had another girl, but she's disabled, she's not well. I just don't understand how any of these comments would have you know, the people that said them, how could they have thought that they were helpful in any type of way? I can't begin to imagine what my mum and my dad must have been going through at that time. People, you know, who had either grandchildren the same age as me or children the same age as me, they never had the same expectations for me as they had for others. You know, people would fall off their chair in amazement that I wanted to go to college, I went to university, the fact that I learned how to drive. These are things that everybody else, all my other peers, were expected to do. I was very capable of doing these things. That's a clear distinction to make, but that was never expected of me. I had been told, oh, why do you need to work? You can claim benefits. But I wanted to be a contribution to society. You know, if for whatever reason I couldn't work, then yeah, it's great that a benefit system might have been able to support me, but that wasn't what I wanted and that wasn't my situation. But that's how I was treated. And I know that some of this comes from people not knowing, you know, what might be available, or people just thinking actually that's a really kind thing to say. But it was difficult because it just felt like I constantly wanted something, but everybody else couldn't see that for me. Therefore, I wasn't encouraged to do any of that. You know.
Did you feel invisible?
Not invisible, because I was very popular. Everyone knew who I was. No, not invisible, but I just felt undervalued, undermined. I felt infantilized. I felt like, you know, I was and even becoming a young woman, people didn't know how to treat me as a young woman. So instead they felt it easy to treat me as a child. That was quite difficult.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Because I think when you have a conditional impairment, people sometimes assume you don't have the same needs and desires as people that don't have conditions and impairments, but that's not true.
Yes.
Then layer upon top of that the whole cultural aspect. So to this day, I've never been pressured to get married. You find me another South Asian woman who could say that to you.
Yeah.
Couldn't find one. And on one hand, I'm kind of glad. But then on the other hand, I'm like, well, why are people treating me differently?
And can you give us an insight, and you already have really, about how much of a full-time job it was growing up with OI? Because as we'll hear later on, you were so keen to kind of get on with the rest of your life. But for everyone listening, and actually people who are suffering from conditions similar to yours, what was it like having this and growing up with it?
You know, I'd started a mainstream school, going from a special needs school. I had gone from like a class size of 8 to like a school of thousands of kids in it. So, that was a big change. And then I got there and I really struggled academically. And I remember coming home and asking my mum for a tutor, like, what kid does that? But I was very lucky, you know, my parents, they both still have manual labour jobs, but they were still able to provide that for me. And then I think it was when I stopped breaking, and then when it came to the point of leaving school, I just didn't know what I wanted to do. Because as a child, all I knew was every summer holiday they broke my leg, and then for months I'd be in hospital, and then for months I'd be in plaster, and then I had to learn how to walk again, and then I'd do it all again. So that was my life for a really long time. I didn't have time to think about what my adult life would look like. No one spoke to me about that. No one said, what do you want to do when you're older? Like, yeah, they asked me that, but I never really knew how to answer that, because I just thought, well, I'll just probably keep breaking, wouldn't I? I think it's fair to say I was pretty unprepared for adult life, thinking back on it now.
There is a story of an instance where you were being spoken about in your presence, and often it would happen with people speaking to your mum. And can you tell us how that makes you feel and what you did in that instance?
Yeah. So a typical example would be at the Gurdwara Sikh temple, and some auntie would be like asking my mum, how's Shani? Is she okay? And I'd be stood next to my mum. And I wasn't a child, you know, I was fully able to speak. That person that was asking my mum knew that. And I'd answer. I'd say, yeah, I'm fine, thank you, how are you? And my mum would tell me off for being rude, and I'd say, no, Mum, actually, they're being rude. You know, I'm standing right in front of them. I can clearly answer for myself. But then, it's coming back to that whole lens of cultural obedience. Girls should be seen and not heard, that horrible line, kids or whatever. So there's lots going on there, isn't there? There's like patriarchy, there's people assuming that it's okay to talk about someone when they're right in front of them, when they can answer for themselves. So things like that were very common occurrences. So that's just an example of when I said I also had to educate my parents as well. So yeah, it was things like that were pretty common, and I think that's why from a young age I had to realise that my voice was a very powerful thing for me to use.
At that stage, how were things from a mental health point of view?
Everyone always says this to me, oh, you're so happy, you're always, so positive. And I am, absolutely. I'm like the biggest optimist ever. And that's, again, I think is a lot from Sikh, Chardhi Kala, which means relentless optimism. But for me, it just boiled down to the fact I had two choices in life. Did I want to let my condition define me, or did I want to define it? Like, yes, regardless, my condition defines me, but I control that narrative of whether that was in a positive way or a negative way. And I'm not saying that just because I chose positive, all my days are pain-free and my life's rose. No, that's not the case. But you have a choice. It's an attitude and it's a mindset, isn't it? So,
absolutely.
And that's what I chose.
And there will be people listening right now, there will be people watching all over, and they will not really believe that discrimination really exists. They will not believe that someone who is as successful as you are and with the incredible things that you have done really ever faced that challenge. But we know full well that actually there was certainly a moment where you faced unbelievable discrimination.
So I can face prejudice, bias and discrimination on the fact of my gender, my race, or people judging my ability, though separately, or all of them together as a consequence of all of that. And sometimes I'll never know which one it is. So I was 16 years old. I just left high school. I'd started college. I just decided to study childcare early years because I really loved kids. They seemed to like me. I think it's because I was the same height as them, but I had more authority and could give them food and play games. So I thought, well, I'll just go and be an astronaut. That seems fun. And I was at college and I started to apply for part-time jobs. I would only apply for jobs I knew I could do, not jobs where I'd need to be on my feet all day. So, already the number of jobs I could apply for were reduced because I was only looking for certain types of jobs. And I had a sentence on my covering letter that described, it just said I've got a condition, but, I don't need any adjustments and it doesn't affect my ability to do this role. I thought it's just best to be upfront about it. It's the first thing people see when they notice me. Why am I going to hide it? It's just best to be honest, and I've addressed it and it's not awkward for anybody. I'd got to the point where I'd applied for over 100 jobs and I hadn't heard anything back. And so I couldn't understand why. So I took that one sentence off my covering letter and I got offered an interview straight away and I got a job in a call centre. So for me, at the age of 16, I had to learn a real harsh life lesson that people are going to judge you or judge your ability on your appearance. I just remember sitting there thinking, I'm going to always have to live at home with my mum and dad, and I didn't want that. And then I thought, well, who's going to die first, me or them? No 16-year-old should ever have to think that because they're not being given opportunities, because they're being judged on their abilities. And I wish I could sit here and say that's changed, but there are so many other people living with conditions and impairments that are very well educated, that have degrees, masters, PhDs, everything. And of course those that don't, because education isn't everything as well. There's so many different routes that can and want to work but aren't being given opportunities because of this massive stigma that we have in society of employing disabled people, when actually research shows that we are one of the most loyal, hardworking and safe employees to ever have. And I think really that becomes down to because we're so grateful just to have a job in the first place. And that whole thing I've just described, that system, that process, that shouldn't be the way in which the world is working, but unfortunately it is right now.
Absolutely. And what followed for you next in terms of your career and what you went on to do, having learned this unfortunate but very real life lesson of unfortunately this is what you were facing?
Sure. So that experience of me not being able to get a job made me feel that I had to have an education to fall back on in terms of a degree. Now, I don't class myself as particularly academic, you know. I went to specialist school, I really struggled at secondary school. I didn't want to go to university at all. Like, I was really done with education because I just found it really hard. Off I went to uni because I just thought, it doesn't matter if I want to do this or not. If I can't even get a part-time job, how can I give any future prospective employer any reason to say, no, we're not going to give you a job because you don't have this or this or this or this. So it actually made me feel like I had to overcompensate, but on a huge scale. So not only did I go to university, I did 3 years of free work experience whilst working part-time.
Wow.
I don't know how I had the time when looking back on it all, but I just felt that I wanted to leave uni with a degree, with 3 years of solid work experience. I just couldn't give anyone a reason to say no, or even think, no, this person's not hardworking, no, she's gonna have loads of time, you know what I mean? I just couldn't, and that was my mindset. You know, I live in a world that isn't designed for me. I have to think creatively and outside of the box every single day. And as an event and project manager, that's what you have to do. So I was really good at it. And I didn't choose that, knowing that or thinking in that way. And it wasn't until I was actually working as an event manager, dealing with like venues cancelling on me, kitchens getting flooded, things like that, and just dealing with it effortlessly. And people saying to me, oh my God, you just dealt with that amazingly. Or just being really creative with my events. That's when I realised, I was like, yeah, I don't find it difficult. But sometimes we have to also recognise when it's unhealthy as well.
And to draw on that, why is it dangerous to have that badge of resilience?
I think for me, I was just reflecting on the fact that being resilient is a great skill to have, right, for anybody. And, you know, as an employer, I would look for that skill in my employees. But to have to be resilient just to survive every day. And when I mean survive, I just mean get up, travel to work, go to work, maybe go to the supermarket and come home again. Should you really have to be resilient just to do those things every day? For me, I would much prefer to live in a society that is more set up, set up for being accessible, set up for being inclusive, not in a society where I'm continually facing barriers. So, you know, I did this thing, a day in the life, where I was followed, and we had a little barrier counter, and every day in my life I faced 12 barriers, from getting up to brushing my teeth, to going to work, to going to get some dinner and coming home again. And those barriers I faced, many other people don't have to face them. So it's unhealthy, because you shouldn't have to be constantly in that mode every single day.
can you tell us about some of the wonderful stages that you have shared with people around the world?
You know, I never set out to be a disability activist. I never set out to do any of this. I just sort of was very frustrated that the progress that I wanted to see in society wasn't happening. And to be truthfully honest, if you had met me at 20, I wanted nothing to do with disability. It wasn't until I learned about the social model of disability, which talks about how people that live with conditions and impairments aren't disabled because of that. They're actually disabled because of the barriers and the bias that we face in society. And the social model was created by disabled people, for disabled people. And, you know, it's the choice of model in the Western world, and lots of organisations have adopted it. But that sometimes doesn't always translate into action. So, you know, instead of focusing on fixing people or curing people, we need to really shift our focus on how we remove barriers, because that's how we're going to progress in a much quicker way for everybody, regardless of whether you have a condition or an impairment or not. Up until that point, until I learnt about the social model, all I had the world telling me was that I was a spontaneous mutation. That was the medical world. Or my culture was telling me that I did something bad in my past life and that I was being punished for it. And none of this made sense to me. So yeah, when I discovered the social model, it feels really cringy to say it, but it really did change my life. I felt as if we could use this and empower people and educate people, we could change this narrative. We could help to challenge the perception that we have of disability. Because, you know, even though we have seen progress, it's still not enough. It's still, you know, a long way off it needs to be. And, you know, the reason so many disabled people have internalised ableism is because we learn about disability from non-disabled people, largely medical professionals. And look, I'm not bashing the medical route. I wouldn't be able to do a lot of what I can without that. I'm very grateful for that. And that has its place, but it's part of a very holistic journey. It can't just be that all you have is a very medicalised approach to your life. It has to include everything else as well.
What are your thoughts about the NHS, and especially now? There are doctors and surgeons, nurses, medical students, nursing students, receptionists, porters, feeling tired, feeling burned out, feeling undervalued. And yet you, in some sense, represent a really important journey for the NHS. And what would you say to NHS workers?
NHS workers, I wouldn't be here without the NHS, full stop. Yeah, I have got so much to be grateful for, and I just think the people that work in the NHS, which include my sister and my dad, are so undervalued, overworked and very underpaid. Goes without saying, but I just want to say, you know, I know it's getting harder and harder. I know the pressure is only ever building and building. It doesn't ever seem to be letting up. But the work that, you know, the work that you do is incredibly, I can't even put it into words, it's so important. And the people that you help, that appreciate it the most, will always be there supporting you and championing you in the work that you do and advocating for the NHS and everything that it needs. And yeah, I thank everybody so much that works in the NHS. We've got, you know, not only me, but everybody else that I know living with conditions and impairments. Like, first of all, we are so lucky to have the NHS, to access it. I know we all complain about, you know, accessing it, waiting times and things, but we've still got that. We still have access to it. I know it's not perfect, but we should still be very grateful that it's here and that it exists. And, you know, anyone that can, we should absolutely support and advocate for the NHS as well, to be here and to get all the support and resources that it needs and to be funded adequately.
Wonderful. And I know that will mean so, so much for anyone who works in the NHS or has needed to lean on the NHS for its services. And I can't thank you enough for being here today and to give us such an important insight into your life, into your achievements, and perhaps most importantly for educating us on how we can be a bit more inclusive.